There it goes. All right. My light bulb's out. I apologize, Madam Secretary. I just want to start by saying one of the reasons I really wanted to be on this committee is its reputation as being bipartisan. And certainly you understand the nature of a bipartisan approach when it comes to this country's infrastructure. I fear with this particular initiative, and to be honest, Madam Secretary, with the tone of this hearing, we're doing great damage to that history of bipartisanship. With that, just as an observation, and as an admonition maybe to all of us that we should refocus on what I think was historically the spirit of this committee. And I'll go back. I remember when my dad was a Republican member of the Massachusetts State Legislature, and he had a close friendship with Governor Volpe, who became the first administrator of the Federal Highway Administration and the second Secretary of Transportation. He worked for President Eisenhower and President Nixon and President Ford in those positions. And he actually advocated for raising taxes because he knew he had to raise taxes and develop revenue, real revenue, as well as making improvements. And I agree with you, there are regulatory and administrative improvements we can do. I look at states like California, where I'm from. We're trying to copy the Department of Transportation in Washington that's done a remarkable job, Minnesota and Massachusetts, and I've tried to engage with some of your staff as how we could use those laboratories of invention at the state level in that regard. So I do think there are opportunities. However, I think you have to be realistic about what the actual benefit will be. So my two questions, first is about what certainly seems to me representing a largely suburban district in the Bay Area, where 70% of my constituents travel out of my district to get to work, where our congestion has increased by 80% in just 5 years because of our economy. The GDP in the Bay Area grew by 11.7% in 2015. It's put enormous pressure on an infrastructure, and we were hoping for some support from the administration in this regard. I see this as more of an attack on urban and suburban commuters. Certainly seems to prejudice towards rural commuters or rural users. And on the history of SB1, as my colleague from Southern California pointed out, you're going to look at, I'll just give you a little history, having been involved in that before I came to Congress as chair of the Transportation Committee in both the Assembly and the Senate. When that passed, it had bipartisan support. It raised the gas tax, it raised the vehicle license fee, and one of the key supporters of that was Senator Cannella from northern San Joaquin Valley, the same area that my friend Congressman Denham represents. So he voted for that because he knew he had to identify revenue for his suburban commuters to reach into Silicon Valley and San Francisco. So my first question, and I'm going to give you both these questions so you can use time to answer both of them, is this seems like an attack on suburban commuters. We have some of the largest super commutes in the Bay Area, and DC in Northern Virginia has similar large super commutes. People taking an hour and a half to 2 hours each way because of the cost of housing and other reasons to commute. There doesn't seem to be, other than the requirement for those commuters to raise their own taxes, state and local taxes, to pay for this with very little support from the federal government. So first question is, could you answer that challenge or that perception? And the second one, and I think more important question I have is, you were quoted on March 29th saying, and I read in quotes of 2017, "The problem is not money, it's the delays caused by the government permitting process that hold up projects for years, even decades, making them risky investments," unquote. And then in 2016, the U.S. Department of Treasury found in a commissioned report, quote, "A lack of public funding is by far the most common factor hindering the completion of transportation and water infrastructure projects," end quotes. So my two questions are, answer the suburban-urban seems like targeted lack of support, and then this your quote saying, well, if we just had regulatory reform and permitting process reform, but your department's saying the opposite. And if you could answer those two questions, I would be appreciative.
First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond. Number one, on the issue, you're phrasing it, and I say this with great respect and with no intention to anger, that this is an attack on suburban areas, which is not true, because the question can actually be turned around. For years and years and years, for decades, rural America has been ignored and forgotten. And so this infrastructure proposal tries to address the needs in rural America. Number two, Marin County, and I don't want to I should not have singled them out because I would probably anger them, but some of these projects that we are talking about are in the richest areas of the country, and we have the rest of the country subsidizing them. On my quote about the problem is not funding, I think the problem is not funding if we allow the private sector to fully participate. But as in the years hence, we have certainly discovered that there are members of Congress who don't want to rely too much on public-private partnerships. If they don't want to rely too much on public-private partnerships, then funding is a problem. And the public-private partnerships, allowing the private sector, allowing the pension funds to come in and invest in public infrastructure was a way to address the funding gap. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam
Thank you.
Secretary. I just say I'm disappointed in your response. You're making this more of a partisan issue than it should be.
I'm not making, I'm not,
Gentleman's time has
my whole
expired.
background has never been
Gentleman's
partisan.
time has
But it seems that
expired.
whenever I say something that people don't like to hear, I'm accused of partisanship. I think that's highly unfair.
Thank the gentlelady. With that,